Israelis managed to get a few headshots at children, and 2 children are now critically ill in hospitals. It's instructive that they were demonstrating to commemorate not just their right of return, but to commemorate the attack in 1969, the arson attack, 1969, sorry, the arson attack on the Al-Aqsa Mosque by a Christian fundamentalist, which almost succeeded because the firefighters were prevented from reaching it. The hose pipes were cut, various different key pieces of equipment were sabotaged. So that's what they were demonstrating for from 69 till today. The dispossession, the attacks on the Palestinians goes on. Today we're looking at 3 topics. The first subject we'll examine is the recent decision, the recent law passed in Bosnia to criminalize genocide denial. And Ronnie Barkin will be talking to Barry about Israel, where commemoration of the Palestinian Nakba, the catastrophe, the mass ethnic cleansing, is criminalized and prevented by other non-criminal means. After that, move to talk about the amazing, disgraceful, shocking expulsion of Ken Loach, the great filmmaker, from the Labour Party, another casualty of the fake anti-Semitism wave. And we're delighted to have Chris Williamson, another, can I say, victim of that anti-Semitism, sorry, of that witch hunt of fake anti-Semitism, who'll be talking about that with Tara. Finally, and we do save the best wine to the end, we'll be looking at the law passed in Poland, which prevents Polish Jews from recovering their pillaged property, pillaged by the Nazis during World War II. And we're delighted to have a giant of Palestinian resistance, Salman Abu Sitta, with us today, and he'll be the final interviewed by Tagrid Al-Mawad, and he'll talk about the violation of Palestinian rights to have their property returned. So without further ado, I'll ask Barry to interview Ronnie Barkin from Israel. Ronnie's a dedicated, consistent, unwavering anti-Zionist and a great supporter of BDS. Over to you, Barry and Ronnie.
Thanks, Mick. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Ronnie Barkin, who is an Israeli activist, a conscientious objector, co-founder of BDS From Within, and most recently a member of Humboldt 3. Ronnie, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Barry.
Recently, in the past few weeks, I've seen that the terms genocide and ethnic cleansing have made the news in relation to Bosnia, where the denial and the glorification of genocide have been outlawed. Excuse me. What I wanted to ask you is, in relation to Israel, what kind of measures, legal or otherwise, have been implemented by the government to prevent the commemoration of the Nakba?
So, as most of the audience would know, there is a Nakba law. It is called the Nakba law, and this law is relatively recent, and it basically denies funding from certain organizations that commemorate the Nakba, especially if they commemorate it as kind of to counter the other Zionist narrative of so-called Israeli independence. Israeli independence, the independence of the Zionist state, and the Nakba are one and the same. But rather than focusing on this or that law, I would argue that the very existence of the state of Israel, the very way it was founded, that Zionist race state, and I refer to it as a Zionist race state because this is not only as a matter of judgment, but also because this is the clearest description of the nature of that state. It is all about 2 very clear values: supremacy and exclusivity. And every single thing that the Zionist race state has done since its very inception is about supremacy and exclusivity, meaning, first and foremost, driving away the indigenous people from their land, denying them the right to return, and denying those who remained equal standing. So basically, the Nakba is part and parcel of the creation of the state of Israel. There is no existence of Israelis as Zionists without the denial, the vehement denial of the existence of Palestinians, whether physically or at least their existence as people of the land, their cultural identity, and so on, their identity as Palestinians.
Okay, and how successful, in your opinion, is the state of Israel in concealing its crimes from its own citizens?
Most of the expelled and demolished villages after 48 have been basically there are man-made forests that have been planted on top of these villages to cover the crime, to cover the destruction, and to also to create facts on the ground in order to deny the return of those people who still yearn to return 7 decades later. And this was done through a sophisticated mechanism via the JNF, the Jewish National Fund. Now, I happened to be recently to some forests, and I saw, and I visited there actually with a Palestinian family who went to their land inside 48. They now live in a refugee camp outside of their territory, and they are denied the right to come back home. And I saw just by visiting that forest, you can see the lengths to which the Zionist state goes into denying the history of that place, obviously denying the expulsion that took place there, denying the vibrant cultural life that was existing up until recently, up until 7 decades ago in that place, and so on. Now, as an Israeli who grew up in Israel, I know firsthand about the whole brainwashing mechanism that takes place. And brainwashing is not necessarily done by, by lying about everything. It is just about creating an alternative narrative, whether it is true or not. Creating an alternative narrative so that people do not actually start questioning what the actual reality is. And this is what we see. I mean, the ones who are what I call honest Zionists, right-wing Zionists, the ones who are racist and proud of it and are unashamed of their racism, they do not have an issue with acknowledging the Nakba, with acknowledging the ethnic cleansing. They simply say, because according to their values, according to their moral judgment or immoral judgment, they say that and ethnic cleansing is not necessarily a bad thing. In this case, this was a good thing because it benefited them. They are what I call the honest Zionists. But the less honest, or the so-called liberal Zionists, for them it is really an issue to acknowledge the Nakba, to acknowledge the issue of return. And they needed to create a whole other narrative in order to feel that they are both Zionist, but also the good guys, but also moral at the same time. And this is much more difficult to overcome, because this is a psychological phenomenon that exists. It exists since the very foundation of the State of Israel. And it is all about basically denying what happened to Palestinians and offering an alternative reality, an alternative narrative, in order for them to not question what actually took place in this land. So also, I will say briefly that whenever we talk about Israel-Palestine, which is one and the same, Israel and Palestine are the exact same spots of land. Anyone who says Israel and Palestine, referring to two different entities, they're already lost. They're already playing into the hands of the propaganda. So when we talk about Israel-Palestine, and we do not discuss the Nakba, and we do not demand the rights of the refugees, first and foremost, we need to demand the rights of the refugees. If we do not do that, we are not actually talking about the Zionist-Palestinian conflict, if you can even call it a conflict. We are not actually talking about what is happening here. The Nakba, the denial of the return, the denial of, for 7 decades, the denial of the rights of 6 million people who are in forced exile, simply for the reason of being born into the wrong ethnicity. That is at the core of everything else that is happening in Palestine. That is the core, at the heart of the legislation that is taking place here. That is at the heart of what Israel is doing on a daily basis. And ethnic cleansing is an ongoing process. It hasn't finished, ethnic cleansing. Unlike genocide, which is a one-off. I mean, once the genocide is complete, there are no people who will demand their rights. With ethnic cleansing, this is an ongoing process. Israel has to carry on denying the rights of those who have been expelled, still carrying on expelling those by different means in the Nakab area, etc. They are treating Gaza, for example. Gaza was built in 1948 as a warehouse for the unwanted population of the Nakab Desert region, and Israel to this day says that we have to upkeep the situation in Gaza. So every few years they have to bombard Gaza, as they do right now, simply because they have to maintain a situation. What is that situation that they have to maintain? It has nothing to do with Hamas. It has nothing to do with rockets. It has to do with wanting to have this surplus population of human beings there and not here. This is what the maintaining of the situation in Gaza is all about. This is what the maintaining of the situation in the refugee camps abroad is all about. Israel is the only country in the region that refused to accept a single refugee coming from Syria and elsewhere, even though it is the one who would be the most responsible for their well-being, especially since many of these refugees, Syrian refugees, are also Palestinian refugees, second and third time refugees.
Thank you, Ronnie. You did mention a sort of a form of indoctrination, or perhaps one could even say brainwashing. I was interested to know how the Israeli Ministry of Education pushes the Zionist narrative onto kids from a very young age, and how does it actually deal with the creation of the state?
Yes, so they create this whole other narrative, as I mentioned, and in that other narrative, basically the whole existence of Palestinians is never mentioned. There is the biblical time, there are all kinds of historical periods, and then all of a sudden there's a gap in the timeline and nothing happened here as far as Palestinians are concerned. Also, by the way, the archaeological institutions are part and parcel of this propaganda that is taking place. I also know for a fact that they are even at times literally destroying artifacts that do not fit their propaganda, if they don't fall in line with that propaganda. Now, along with that alternative narrative that is being offered to children here, they're being told that obviously that there was this diaspora of Jews around the world, and then finally some miracle happened and they united back after many, many, many years or millennia. And then they're also being told that actually Israel is a state that seeks peace, seeks to live with in coexistence with its neighbors and so on. So the brainwashing is done in a very subtle way. They're not being told to hate the others. They're only being told that, first of all, that the others do not want their existence here. And secondly, they're being told that, we have tried, we have made all sorts of efforts. We don't know, they're playing the victim in this situation. And this is much more easy. This is much easier to accept and to, as I mentioned before, to feel that actually we're the good guys. We're trying. Maybe we're not perfect, but we're trying. Even the name of the Israeli military, which is a terror organization by definition, is the Israel Defense Forces. And people genuinely believe that it has something to do with defense, even though it doesn't. It never did anything that is defensive. Even Israeli wars, other than possibly the War of 73, were all wars of aggression. Every single one of them, it's all documented. And yet people still think that this is a defense force, and they believe in, so this indoctrination takes place from kindergarten. Children are being taught to be soldiers literally from kindergarten. They're being told about, that we are extending our hands for peace and so on. But at the same time, they're not being told anything about what is happening here. Every single place that I walk, that I walk around in Palestine, in Israel, what is called Israel, there used to be a Palestinian village wherever I would go. And whenever I go hiking or whatever, just for trips with my family, with my nieces, etc., I would tell them, I would open up the iNakba app, for example, and I would tell them, okay, let's see which village we're visiting today. And here was this village, Palestinian village, and there was that Palestinian village. And this is a whole totally erased part of history. And psychologically, it is very convenient for Israelis to simply not know about these issues. So if you scratch the surface, or if you just take a second look, you will see it because it is there. But it is much easier psychologically to look away. So people, I think, are being trained to look away, and that is the success of Israeli propaganda. They're not being lied as much as being told, you know, let's move on, let's not question these issues.
Well, that brings me to a question that I did want to ask, which was, in your opinion, does Israeli society actually know what happened and they choose basically not to care, or is it a case that they're just not aware of what happened in the lead up to the creation of the state of Israel?
So the honest Zionists, the right-wing Zionists, they know and they don't care. The majority, I would say, which both are among the right wing and the so-called left, they don't know and they don't want to know. And for them, it is much more difficult realizing what this is all about. You know, people still think, also the audience here still think that the issue that we should be concerned about, the main issue in Israel-Palestine is about that military, harsh, brutal military occupation. It is not. The harsh, brutal military occupation of 1967 is nothing more than a symptom. It is yet another act of aggression and terror against a civilian population by the Zionist race state. And it is also the most natural outcome, the most natural thing that could happen in 1967 was that occupation, which follows everything that happened before that. And we don't have time to go into the whole timeline and explain why, but we have to focus on how the state came into being by basically expelling as many people as they could, denying the right to return, and making sure that there will never ever be the possibility for equality, equal standing between those people in this land. So it is not a territorial dispute. It is definitely not a religious dispute, etc. It is a question of not only the territory, but who is allowed to live on that territory. So everything that the Zionist state does is about that question of which type of population is allowed to live here. And as I mentioned, it is about supremacy and exclusivity. Supremacy means that myself, as belonging to the group, the entitled group, I deserve all the rights. But the exclusivity part also means that this place is ours and only ours. And anyone else who doesn't belong to our group doesn't belong here at all. And by their very existence, they pose a threat and a problem to the existence of the state of Israel. And I can go into many quotes explaining, like demonstrating that.
Ronnie, you've got 2 minutes.
Yeah, we don't have much time. Ronnie, what I wanted to ask you mentioned previously the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, and how they're complicit in concealing the depopulated villages, shall we say, through planting forests and parks. In many of these instances, the intention is to create a more European landscape by using trees that are not indigenous to Palestine and they're not suitable for the climate. So the JNF likes to dress themselves up as an environmental organization, but how much do their actions lead to the forest fires that we actually see in Israel and we've even seen recently?
Yes, there is definitely that issue of planting trees that are not indigenous, that are not suitable for this landscape, and this is responsible for quite a few fires that happened in the past. And I do not come from that field, but there have been reports about how this type of vegetation is simply not suitable. And is also, by the way, these trees that have been planted, like the eucalyptus and others, are basically they take over the ecosystem, and they have been responsible for basically destroying part of the original ecosystem that existed here. Secondly, obviously, they come to cover up the vegetation that existed here, and especially there are clear signs that everyone who has been looking for these destroyed villages, they know there are these markings. For example, these rows of cactus fruit that still exist to this day because they're very resilient, like Palestinians, and they are one of these markings that when I see a row of cactus, I know that there used to be a Palestinian village there, along with a few other signs. Israel, what it did, it planted these different this type of vegetation that didn't belong there. It took over. It did also this cultural appropriation. So the oranges, the Palestinian oranges, became a symbol of Zionism, Jaffa oranges. The sabas, the cactus fruit, became a symbol of Zionism. You know, when they use the term sabas, they mean a Zionist, an Israeli, and on and on. And this is part of it. This erasure is happening on so many different levels.
Okay, friends, I have to interrupt and bring this excellent interview to an end. Ronnie, thank you from me, and concluding remarks, a few words.
Yes, just one sentence. We mentioned the denial of genocide in Bosnia and elsewhere. We do have to take this issue of genocide very seriously, and I would argue that Nakba denial is akin to Holocaust denial. And this is, we should look at this in that light. Those who deny the Nakba and those who deny the rights of Palestinians are coming from the exact same place that those Holocaust deniers come from.
Thank you, friends.
I urge the audience to think about that.
Very much. Ronnie, thank you. Thank you, Barry. We're moving on quickly to our next guest. We want to deal with the amazing story that the great filmmaker Ken Loach has been expelled from the Labour Party as a racist. Look, the world has turned upside down. We're delighted to have Chris Williamson here today, who was also driven out of the Labour Party as a racist. Look, I'm going to scratch my head while you two discuss what's going on. Please, can you enlighten viewers as to what the hell is going on here?
Thank you for that impassioned little introduction there, Mick. So yeah, as Mick has said, I'm delighted to be joined today by Chris Williamson. Chris is a former Labour MP, a founder member of Resist, the Movement for a People's Party, and is a Palestinian rights activist. So thank you very much for joining me today, Chris.
Oh, thanks for inviting us on. Good to be here.
Good stuff. So as Mick has mentioned there, yes, you yourself have been a victim of what many are on the left are terming the witch hunt that we're currently seeing within the Labour Party. You were suspended for speaking out against the way that they were dealing with allegations of anti-Semitism. So really on the basis of that experience, I mean, what is your reaction to the frankly outrageous expulsion of Ken Loach from the Labour Party recently?
Well, I'm not surprised, but it's absolutely hideous behaviour by a party which has completely lost touch with its grassroots, it's lost touch with reality, and it seems to be doing the bidding, frankly, of the Zionist lobby in this country. As you mentioned, I was targeted and suspended. Actually, I was suspended, then reinstated. And after a furore in the media that was drummed up by, again, the Israeli lobby and the right wing of the Parliamentary Labour Party, most of whom are members of the so-called Friends of Israel, I was then resuspended. That was then subject to a High Court case that I took against the Labour Party and won, that the judge ruled that suspension was unlawful. But the party sought to delay the hearing. I was seeking an expedited hearing at that time because a general election was on the horizon, and they kept saying in the preliminary hearings that I was merely speculating, that there was no evidence of an early election, that the parliaments were now subject to the fixed term parliament legislation, and that meant that the election wouldn't come until 2022. And it took 3 hearings before I was able to get a final date. The third preliminary hearing, the judge set the date. And 6 days before I was due then to appear in court, I was hit with a fresh set of allegations, and a new suspension was imposed. And I received a letter saying that irrespective of the outcome of your appeal, you will remain suspended. We did try to persuade the court to consider that, because it was clearly a ruse in order to subvert a potential negative decision against the party, positive in my respect, obviously, which was what the court did rule in our favour. But the courts are very low to get involved in private organisations, which is what the Labour Party is considered to be, and therefore said that although the resuspension was unlawful, the judge said that it doesn't insulate me from new allegations, and as these are only 6 days old, it wouldn't be appropriate for the court to intervene. And I was just a tip of the iceberg. So many people had been suspended, high-profile people like Ken Livingstone and Jackie Walker, who was the vice chair of Momentum, a black Jewish woman married to a Jewish man. People like Cyril Chilson, who was the son of two Holocaust survivors, actually, were on the death march, the Auschwitz death march, and he was accused of anti-Semitism and suspended for bringing the party into disrepute. And then many other people who are not as high profile as those. And people like Mark Wadsworth, of course, another high profile black rights activist, was targeted and thrown out of the Labour Party on bogus anti-Semitism allegations. And of course, it's now moved on to the situation now where, I was accused falsely of a pattern of behaviour. My pattern of behaviour actually was defending predominantly Jewish people, actually, who'd been people like Cyril Chilson and others, and Jackie Walker and so on, who've been falsely accused of anti-Semitism. And that was really the sum total of their sort of so-called pattern of behaviour, one or two other extraneous examples, which again didn't really amount to a row of beans. But now we're in this absurd scenario where merely having an association with or refusing to disavow your previous associations with people, like myself and others who are members of and involved with the proscribed organisations, now gets you suspended, actually not suspended, actually expelled from the Labour Party. It's an auto-expulsion. This is unbelievable for a party which tries to portray itself as a progressive entity standing up against injustice, when it's actually responsible for delivering the most grotesque level of injustice against lifelong anti-racists. And when you talk about people like Ken Loach, he spent his life fighting injustice, fighting against racism, and using his enormous platform to actually take that message out to the wider general public. And really, we have descended, it seems, or the Labour Party has descended to the depths where they are resorting to expelling somebody of Ken Loach's standing in society.
Well, thanks for giving us that summary, actually, of your own experience and the wider issue within the Labour Party. I'm sure there will be people watching today who are aware of what's been going on, but I think it's really useful to have that broader explanation, because it does seem bizarre, frankly, that a party that is built on fighting oppression, championing human rights, and fighting apartheid has decided to take this stance. What do you think the Labour Party are gaining from this?
Well, I can't see they're gaining very much at all. You look at the opinion polls and they are a long way behind the most appalling government, which is completely messing up not just the economy, but the response to the COVID crisis. There are huge open goals, it seems to me, for any credible opposition to be landing substantial blows against a government as incompetent as this one is. And they're not achieving that. And they seem to be obsessed with this whole nonsense about anti-Semitism, which is a hoax. The Labour Party has never been riddled with anti-Semites. When they actually looked at it in detail, it was less than 0.04% of members had been accused, never mind being found guilty. When you actually look at the numbers of people who had actually indulged in, as it were, been demonstrated to have indulged in anti-Semitism, it was an even smaller figure than that. I think it was about 12 people out of, at that point in time, a membership of approaching 600,000. And when you take the registered supporters into account, we're looking at in the order of around 800,000 individuals. And they were able to identify 12 people. It's this absurd state of affairs. And you kind of wonder whether or not it's almost as they're behaving as if they've been sort of planted there by the kind of neoliberal establishment to prevent a credible alternative being developed to give people a choice in the election. And frankly, now we're in a situation where, as I've said, the Labour Party is miles behind. They've been totally annihilated in Scotland anyway, but in the rest of the country, they're miles behind the Conservative Party. But look, even if they were to, by some miracle, and Keir Starmer is seen as a safe pair of hands by the establishment, and I could see, as we saw with Tony Blair, the Murdoch empire coming out behind him. And, should the event arise where, by some fluke they do manage to win the subsequent general election, what difference will it make? The Labour Party is now the kind of war machine. They are enthralled to the military-industrial complex. They are, Sir Keir Starmer said he's a Zionist without, or supports Zionism without qualification. The project, the Corbyn project, was one which proposed a socialist alternative, an anti-imperialist foreign policy, a foreign policy which would have seen a minister appointed for peace and disarmament, which was an incredible proposition when you think about it, a permanent member of the UN Security Council promoting peace and disarmament instead of war and arms sales. And obviously that project, Jeremy Corbyn and the people around him, had to be taken down. And now we're in a situation where, a Labour government under this particular leadership would not really be that much different to the Conservatives. They embrace neoliberalism. They, as I've already said, embrace the military-industrial complex. They're not at all, it seems to me, concerned about the appalling oppression of the Palestinian people, or indeed oppression around the world. As I say, they're not concerned about imperialism. They are very much at the centre of an imperialist, or continuing an imperialist project. So, I think the future is fairly bleak on the mainstream political front, and that's why I've, with others, launched this initiative, a Resist Movement for a People's Party, to look at trying to build a alternative grassroots movement, to look at potentially building an alternative electoral vehicle. But what we hope to achieve by that is to bring people together, bring progressives, people on the left, bring people together. And we have to find a way of collaborating, it seems to me, outside the Labour Party. And unless we do that, then I don't think there is a future for progressive left-wing electoral politics in this country.
Yeah, you mentioned there about, from a party political perspective, things do look quite bleak, and I definitely agree with you. It's, I guess in Scotland it's maybe not quite so bleak because we don't have the kind of the two-party system, and there's a cigarette paper between the two of them now. So it's it's not great in Westminster. But I think what do you think the future is for left-wing Labour Party members who are active pro-Palestinian activists? What do you think the future holds for them? And I guess more broadly, perhaps as well, because certainly I know from my own experience that there have been parallels in terms of people within trade union movement have also been investigated and suspended because of their activism, their Palestinian activism. So I guess that it's more broadly, there's perhaps a question about the future for people within the trade union movement and the left generally who are active pro-Palestinians. What do you think the future holds for them?
Well, I think I come back to that point about collaboration. It's really important, I think, that we work together with the range of different groups that are out there. I think direct action has to be the way forward in many ways. We see this with Palestine Action, with the direct action that that they're taking on the streets and against Israeli arms manufacturers in this country. And I think we also need to work within the trade union movement and to promote this notion of greater democracy in the labour movement. The trade unions are huge monolithic organisations, and I think we need to. I would encourage people to get involved in their trade unions, their local trade union branches, and so on, and sort of demand those kind of reforms, because the trade union movement, although it's a lot smaller than it was in the 1970s when I got involved in politics, it is still an incredibly powerful voice in this country, or has the potential to be anyway. And I think it's really important, therefore, that people work through the trade union movement, but other organisations, other direct action groups, and other as it were pressure groups, to bring pressure to bear and to push this case. Look, I think as far as the Palestinian question is concerned, just to take my own local city as an example, and I know this was replicated around the country. I wasn't involved in organising it, but I did speak at a rally that had been organised in Derby city centre, not by the usual suspects. I mean, the Labour movement wasn't, particularly visible in terms of the day. Certainly not involved in organising it, as normally happens with sort of protests and rallies in the city. And it was the biggest protest rally that we've ever held in Derby. It was enormous, and it was an incredibly uplifting experience to be part of that. And there was the following week, there was another rally and indeed a march. And what was interesting was that as we marched through the city, people were coming out of the shops and the pubs and applauding them. And many were actually joining in. So the procession massively multiplied as we marched from one end of the city to the other. And I think that was something that was replicated elsewhere. So that does give me hope that, people, the scales have fallen from people's eyes. And in many ways, I think the Zionist lobby's overreached itself in the actions that they've taken against lifelong anti-racists. As I've mentioned, people like Tony Greenstein, the son of a rabbi, and Jackie Walker, black Jewish woman, former vice chair of Momentum, and many others as well, Ken Livingston, etc. And it's, people have started to explore, I think, a bit more about, well, what's this all about? What's this issue going on in Palestine? And so many more people, I think, are now aware of the despicable behaviour of the Israeli state. And I just think that gives us, hope for the future, that, through protests, through direct action, through working within our trade union, we have respective trade unions, and potentially, getting involved in groups like ours, Resist Movement for a People's Party. We saw the Workers' Party, for example, as well, which is a new party which has been established, almost actually pulling off a sensational by-election victory in Batley and Spen earlier this year. And so, there is, I think, now an appetite amongst the wider general public for something different. We saw that really with a massive upsurge in membership of the Labour Party when Jeremy Corbyn came along. And, people all over the country, I think, were inspired by the message and the policy programme that he was advocating. So I think we need to hold on to that. And, those people haven't disappeared into the ether. And we need to somehow, dust ourselves down and find a way of, as I've said, collaborating, working together and moving forward in solidarity.
Can I come in on that note and thank Chris and Tara for discussing that? Chris, we'll end on that uplifting note because we've got to seek optimism where we can. But you're absolutely right. They may have reached a high water mark. Thanks very much, Chris, for joining us today, and Tara.
Yeah,
friends, the final session is prompted by the news from Poland that the government there has made it impossible for Jews whose property was plundered by the Nazis to recover that property. Salman Abu Sitta has made it his life's work, and a productive life's work indeed, to show how the recovery of plundered property in land and more is not only moral and just, but is actually possible. A big welcome to Salman Abu Sitta. Can you, Jimmy, or can we see Salman? Can you switch on your camera and microphone, Salman?
Thank you, Mick. Thank you.
And Tagreed Al-Mawad. Where is Tagreed hiding?
Hello.
Hello. Marhaba.
Tagreed, we can't see you. Can you switch on your camera? There we go. Tagreed Al-Mawad is a Palestinian. We lost her recently from Edinburgh, Scotland, to the Celtic Fringe in Wales, but through the miracle of telephony, we have her here. She's going to discuss with Salman Abu Sitta, a giant of Palestinian resistance, a man I'm proud to call my friend. Tagreed, you've got this man for 20 minutes, and I'm afraid I'll have to interrupt you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Mick. And first I would like to say thank you, Dr. Salman, for giving us your precious time. And I would like to add to a little bit of introduction to yourself, to remind people and to introduce you to others that as a historian, researcher, you hold PhD in civil engineering, plus you were a professor in one of the Canadian universities. So other than what you were well known for is mapping of Palestine in the 19th century, 20th century, and the 21st, plus developing a practical plan for implementing the Palestinian right of return, plus your books, which is The Return Journey, The Palestinian Nakba 1948, Mapping My Return, Atlas of Palestine. So my question will be following this introduction. And for us being roughly 13 million refugees around the world, today I would like, to ask you, like, how it's ironic that that the Israeli is complaining about Poland's anti-Semitic treatment of the Jews that have a legitimate right to claim property that was stolen from them, while denying Palestinians like you and I that have been equally legitimate right to land and property stolen from them by the Zionists. And as people, we're living this Nakba until today. Can you join us, share with us your precious opinion, please?
Thank you, Tagreed. Thank you, Tagreed. Yes, indeed, this is an irony. It's a very big irony. It's a macabre irony. It has no dimensions which you can compare with. Why is it an irony? Here is a case of Polish people complaining about their government of not being able to recover their property taken from them during the Second World War. Normally, in any country, this is a legitimate thing. You complain about your government, why there are laws which allow you, not allow you to recover your property. But there is a big dimension here. Those people who are Polish citizens are Polish Jews. And those very same people who claim the right to recover their property are the ones who left Poland and became the main thrust of the Haganah and became the main backbone of Zionism. They left to a country they have never seen before, across the seas, in order to occupy a country they have never seen before. And they wanted to take that country out of the people of the country. They came in the Haganah, 120,000 soldiers in 9 brigades, and through 31 military operations, they depopulated 500,000 villages, and they destroyed these villages, and they took their property, they took their land. So someone who's claiming from his government to recover his home in his own city has started to invade another country and take over that country completely for 73 years and making its people refugees. The figures are devastating. The policy is devastating. What kind of irony, what kind of macabre irony that people claim before the Polish government to recover their land. And they are the very same people who committed crimes, war crimes of 156 war crimes. They have taken over Palestine. When they came to Palestine in 1948, the area granted to them by various means by the British was no more than 1,500 square kilometers. By military force, those Polish soldiers, who are mostly Polish, there were others too, they occupied 20,500 square kilometers, and they called it Israel. And I can challenge any Israeli today, he can prove any claim, any title deed to any kilometer, to any acre of land they are occupying today. So most of Israel today is actually illegitimately obtained by nothing less than brute military force, in which massacres are taking place, in which population of these towns and villages are now 8 million people. Two-thirds of the Palestinian people are refugees, and their claim, which are very well substantiated, to return to their homes is denied by those Polish Jews who now sue the Polish government. It really needs Kafka's presentation to show the irony. Now, the problem will continue with us, and we will never give up our right of return. If you have received my two maps, we can show them if they are available. Next one, the other one, please, first, and then this second one. Yeah, right. Now, when those Polish Jews, Haganah, took our land, they wanted to hide some of the lands they conquered under a new name, which is outside Israel. So they agreed with Jewish National Fund, which projects itself as environmental agency outside Palestine. It did not exist in Palestine at the time. And with offices in 45 countries around the world, saying that they are a charity organization. This group, the NF, made a deal with Ben-Gurion right in the middle of 1948. Ben-Gurion was afraid that the United Nations will force the refugees to come back, and take their property, their land. So what he did, that Ben-Gurion, made a fictitious sale agreement with the JNF, which was international organization, saying, we sold you 2 million dunams. This is a fictitious sale, it's a legal sale, and actually no money was changed hands. So this JNF took over the land I have shown here in yellow or brown, and they actually took the land of 372 Palestinian villages whose people are refugees today. Yes. 372. And what they did with it, they actually did something very unusual. JNF has helped actually in the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. They directed the military operations. They actually worked on the destruction of the villages, and they took the land under their wing. Now, with that, they wanted to hide the debris of the destroyed homes, so they planted trees. They called them forests. And as one of my Palestinian colleagues call it, he said, this is a crime converted into a virtue. The crime of destroying a village and taking the land is converted into a virtue. What's this virtue? It's improving the environment by building forests in there. And to make this legitimate and to cash on publicity on that, they named these parks in the names of Western politicians who supported Zionism. You have Balfour Forest, you have Churchill Forest, and all that. So this is the situation until today. And the irony again is that the JNF in England receives donations from people who are tax-free. People are paying tax-free money in order to commit and maintain a crime. Now, we said we would like to trace these forests and see in whose land it was built. Here is an example. Next map, please. Here's an example. Next map. Yes, here it is. Here is an example. I'll show you a park called Britannia Park. Britannia Park. The blue line is the outline of the park, and the black line is the limit of the villages whose land is taken from them. You can see they have taken the land from Ajur, from Deir al-Dubban, from Rana, from Kidna, and below Beit Jibrin, and one other. So the land of those villages taken by JNF, we have identified that. We have identified how much land they have taken from each village. We went further, and then we located the owners of this land who are refugees today. We got their names. We know in which refugee camp they are living today. And so the body of the crime materialized in detail. Here is the land stolen from people. We know who the victims are. We know how much is stolen and where it is. And with the help of Scottish Society of Palestine,
Yes.
I think they will take action within UK courts to challenge the status of charity of JNF. So we are pursuing them in every possible way, in the field of knowledge, in the field of courts, and above all, in the hearts of the minds of the Palestinians who will never give up their right of return.
Exactly. Thank you. And I've just have like a question as well for your books. It's like I consider the true history, which is not being taught in universities or in the curriculum. So how can started forcing universities in Britain to acknowledge the Palestinian and the existence of us? Because I'm telling you through experience, I was at one of the British unis, and there is no acknowledgement, no recognition of Palestinian or the land. All what they mention as just like a number, and they start talking about Israel. So one of my question is, how could we, and with your books, force them to put us in a place that we could ask for compensation for the massacres we've been through inside the occupied Palestine and outside the occupied Palestine, when they're gonna say sorry and admit about all of this chaos we're living in until now, because we know our families who still in Lebanon in camps are still struggling, no human rights, etc. So how can I and you force the acknowledgement of your books? And at uni, when they mention the professors and doctors, all massacres committed against all other nations, and forgetting about me and forgetting about my existence as I am Palestinian born in Lebanon as a refugee, so I exist. How could we start spreading it in us Arab world? Please, can you give us your advice and your opinion, please?
Knowledge, knowledge, knowledge is the enemy of the criminal. Who's afraid of the truth? Obviously, the criminal who committed the crime. Nobody would hide the truth except the criminal. In the history of Zionism, they waged against the Palestinians 11 kinds of wars, 11 kinds of wars. Only one of them is military. The others are erasure of the history, of the geography, of the archaeology, of even the name of Palestine, of the political rights, and so on. And therefore, they have been trying all the time in order to start with the biggest myth that Palestine is a land without people for people without a land. Yes. And if that's the case, why you have a problem? Why there are 14 million Palestinians today? So I think there is hope now. Some years back, when we were trying to talk to people in England, for example, where I was, it was very difficult because there is a big, thick wall of denial among, not only among Israelis, of course, but among ordinary Europeans. Now, this wall of denial has been broken to a large extent. Why? Because the social media has no barriers. It can really convey knowledge across countries and so on. In this Zoom we are talking about, I remember 20 years ago, if I hold a conference with people, you have to travel and you have to meet people and you have to get visas and you have to pay cost of hotels and so on. Now you can communicate with anybody in the world through this media. So the control of the Zionism on the media, which was, let me say this, I am born before a Nakba.
Yes.
And I'm sure when I looked at the history over the last 70 years, I would imagine that if there were Al Jazeera or there was internet, or there were, out of 156 massacres, probably 1 or 2 will happen. The others will make the world so mad about these crimes that they would stop them. There were at the time 5 or 6 news agencies controlled by Western powers and by Zionism. Now, anyone with a mobile telephone in Gaza, he can tell his story on top of the ruins of his home. So that's one thing. The other is, I have great faith in the young people who are now very well educated, and they are distributed around the world. They are confident, they are articulate, and they can tell the truth. But this is not enough. This is not enough. Here is a case, for example, which the Scottish PSC are fully aware of. People like JNF collects money from people, from their hard work, and considered to be tax exempt. Instead of using that money to build a hospital in Scotland, it is used to aid a thief and a robber to take somebody else's property and claim it his own. And also, piece of land from any village is given a name of Britannia Park or Canada Park or all that, which is really stolen property. You know, a police would catch someone with stolen property, they call it fencing, So how come those people, those very same people who today agitate against the Polish government about their property as Polish citizens in a Polish government? Now, why did these Polish citizens leave and make an army and kill and take other people's land? There is not a single acre in Israel today taken by anything other than by military force. So this situation, I'm sure, very odd, and we cannot last.
Agreed. Can you get some final concluding remarks from our esteemed guest?
Yes, I would say, let us keep on doing what we are doing now. Let us spread the word of truth. Again, I say, only the criminal is afraid of the truth. Let me tell you one thing, Tagreed and Mick. In the last 25 years, I published so many papers and so atlases and maps and so on. Now, not one of them has been challenged by Israelis about its accuracy. Why? Because the facts given are documented. It's not an opinion. It is not my political belief. No, they could not find anything wrong with the data. So the important thing about our case when we spread it in the world is to make sure that your documentation is correct. For example, Benny Morris, the Israeli historian, spent a lot of time searching every page in my atlas to find something wrong. And in the end, he could not find anything. Why? Because the truth is glaringly obvious, right? Our job is to show it. And I think we have a lot to do I know the obstacles against us are big, but the fact that small group people, BDS, or the PSC activity and others like it in other countries with good intentions, with good heart, and with modest means, they made a mark. They made a mark. So the elephant in the room will be exposed as it is a big criminal. And that's our job.
Thank you.
Agreed.
Yes.
Agreed,
Yes.
Salman. We have to bring this to an end. I do apologize. We could
Yes.
discuss for a very long time. But look, friends,
Yes.
this is a current affairs program. We'll be back next week. I'm sure Tony Blair will be on the TV between now and then, again, arguing for war. Next week, it may have come to your attention that 1,000 Canadian children and adults were found in graves. That's only 2 of 230 native schools. Next week, we'll have Nahla Abdo, Palestinian author based in Canada. Nahla will talk about settler colonialism in Canada and in Israel, genocide in Canada, now widely recognized, and the massive genocidal violence of the Israeli state. We'll also be looking at the massive victory in Manchester, where the Zionists, lawyers for Israel, succeeded briefly in removing a statement of solidarity from the exhibition there by Forensic Architecture. Solidarity and mass pressure forced the university to reinstate the statement of solidarity with the Palestinians. We'll be talking to somebody with intimate knowledge of that. It may not have escaped your knowledge that guerrillas, whatever you think of the Taliban, they're Afghans who resist foreign occupation. And it may have come to your attention that guerrillas on mopeds in sandals defeated an invasion financed by $2 trillion. Yvonne Ridley is an expert on Afghanistan. She was on the boat to Gaza to try to relieve the siege. She's a stalwart champion of Palestinian rights, a professional journalist who's widely published until she became openly pro-Palestinian. Yvonne will be joining Nahla Abdo and a speaker to talk about the Manchester victory next week on Sunday 60 Minutes. A final thank you in reverse order to Salman Abu Sitta, to Chris Williamson, and to Ronnie Barkin to join us. We will be having guests of this caliber in the weeks to come as we look at current affairs and relate them to something more profound than the passing headlines. Friends, thanks again for joining us today. Thank you to our viewers, and thank you to our speakers and interviewers. This is Mick Napier from Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, thanking all concerned. Thank you, and I hope to see you next week. In the meantime, for follow-on information, the work of Salman Abu Sitta, the story of Chris Williamson, Ronnie Barkin's wonderful stuff, go to www.scottishpsc.org.uk. Thank you again, and bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mick. Thank you, Tagreed. I hope you return to Safuria.
Inshallah. I mean, okay. Shukran.